Thank you so much. I've got my presentation in two phases. The first phase will show you some of the more conventional work we do as architects, and then the second phase shows you how we scale that up to work at the level of a city or at the level of an ecology. And I'll start with that. Our practice is about 15 years old. I've been working as an architect for 20 years, and much of that work has been preceded by a period of education and teaching and research and writing, which took place mostly in the United States. But for the last decade, my partner Christine Mueller and I have been based fully in India, working across a range of landscapes. Next, please. This is the building that really started our career. We were very lucky to receive a grant from the Graham Foundation in Chicago, and about 15 years ago, we were in Pondicherry, and we came across the most remarkable work of architecture. And I think part of my learning in these last 24, 30 hours has been, how do you design in adversity? How do you design in conflict? How do you design with scarcity? This building, it's the first time a concrete building was built in India in 1939. And 1939 is the year that the World War broke out. India didn't manufacture any steel. It didn't manufacture any cement. And yet Sri Aurobindo and his companion, the mother, commissioned two of the most amazing young architects, Antonin Raymond and George Nakashima, to build an absolutely avant-garde modern dormitory for the Aurobindo ashram in Pondicherry. Next. And when Christine and I walked in with our students to see this building, I was amazed because I had never seen it in any books of history or research. The material choices where the wood, the kadapa stone, and then technologically, for the time, very advanced louvers were used to create a thermal, cool, temperate enclosure against the heat and the humidity of a tropical climate in Pondicherry. Next. Look how beautifully in 1939 they understood that with just 2 or 3 materials, oiled Burma teak, natural stone floors, lime plastered walls, that you could create an environment which perpetuated the ethos of spirituality, of aesthetics, of excellence. Even today, 75 years after this building was finished, if you walk in, this is what you find. And that is actually even more important, that the maintenance of the building, the culture of looking after something that has been built with care, is so deeply permeating the consciousness of the ashram ethos. Next. So our very first building was built in Boston, in a little town called Wellesley. It's a library. It's 900 square feet. Our clients were an Iranian couple who had been exiled when the revolution happened, and they suddenly realized that their daughters were almost teenagers and had no idea about the history, the culture, the painting, and the poetry of where they came from in Tehran. So they asked us to do a small library which would be open to scholars and students from Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is the hub of a kind of university setting, MIT, Harvard, Wellesley. And so this 900 square foot library became really a kind of testing point for us on how we could create iconography that was appropriate to the climate with a very, very low budget. All the snow melts off this steeply pitched roof and collects into an underground cistern. Even the shed that stores the cartons of the books and artifacts is designed as a lamp at night in the garden. And the library, the books float above this line of light, the cantilevered concrete slab, which is actually heated with radiant heat tubes, so the building remains thermally temperate in the cold winter of Boston. Next. In Delhi, we were given a really tiny little shell in Kotla, which is a hardware market in Delhi. It had no windows, and we were given the scraps of wooden flooring because that's what our client sold. And so we created an entire interior with the scraps that his labor burns in the winter to keep themselves warm. We had a 3 lakh rupee construction budget for 1,000 square feet. And we used every single piece of that timber to make the doors, to make the benches, to basically create and evoke the sense of walking in a forest. So it's not a showroom for wood, but it connects you spiritually with what it means to take a walk in a forest. What I'm showing here is really an attitude, again, about understanding and distilling a material presence in the work of an architect. Next, please. Our very first building in India, freestanding, we were asked by a client to design a research and development center outside of Udaipur in a tiny village called Madri. There was not even a construction crane there, and we had to do a 40,000 square foot building. We used only local stone. We scaled the building to evoke some of the grandeur of the landscape, to evoke some of the scale of these amazing forts and palaces that we found in that landscape. This building was built with 150 daily wage laborers working by hand with no sophisticated equipment, and it was built for 1800 rupees a square foot. We don't need big budgets. We don't need the wealthy to come and patronize us. We just need really clear and explicit knights of faith who have good intentions, who allow the architect to practice her or his craft without adulteration. Next, please. This is what the building looks like at night. And the purpose was very clear. In this desolate, quarried, toxic landscape, which is littered with the kind of rape and pillage that we do across our urban landscape or the peri-urban landscape, we wanted to create a point of pride for the local community. This building, all of the sewage is recycled on site. There's a sewage treatment on site. All the rainwater from the terrace is collected, used to flush toilets and wash hands. So it's a very, very low footprint. The apertures are all only on the north side, not on the south or the west side. So the building has a very low heat load. Again, these are just basic, common sense, intelligent design decisions. Next, please. This is the first house we were asked to build. It's a load-bearing seismic zone 4 construction, all done in exposed brick. I grew up very close to Nizamuddin, so as a child my parents would take me for walks into Humayun's tomb, which at that time was kind of occupied and desolate, but I was always inspired by the scale and the size of the openings of the jharokas and the jalis. And so you see it's a west-facing house, so deep recesses to protect the inhabitants. The house is thermally very, very cool, and again trying to bring back into the capital city a pride of place and craft and the making of architecture. Nothing will ever need to be painted. Nothing will ever need cosmetic beautification. The material of the structure is the material of the presence, and most importantly, it adds dignity to the street. That was part of our intention. It's not a private home just for the people inside. It's also a street facade for the people walking by it on the outside. Next, please. So you can see we painstakingly draw every brick, every detail, so that we can sit on the site and tell the mason, we know how to help you do it. We're not making mystical drawings which then get cheapened by the L1 tender process and come out like looking pale shadows of what they were intended to be. We stand on the site and we help the people who work with us to produce this kind of work. Next, please. As a child, I remember spending many, many summers in Pahalgam and Gulmarg, and I would always, at the last day before we left back for Delhi, we were given kangris. And I was a very curious and pyromaniac child. And so I once remember taking the kangris from the clay pot and pouring them into the basket and burning my hands in the process. But it was almost worth it for that 5-second thrill of watching the basket catch fire. So when we were asked to design the headquarters of the UN Women's building in Delhi, I thought of that kangri, and I thought, my goodness, how do you make a material just become capable for 1 second, giving you that spark of making you feel connected to a larger, potentially dangerous identity? Next, please. And that's what the building does at night. It does exactly what that kangri did in my hands as a child. So you tap into this rich and fertile bank of memory as an architect to produce that which has meaning. These are not expensive projects. By Delhi standards, these are built for about 3,000, 3,500 rupees a square foot, inclusive of lighting, air conditioning, windows and doors. Many of my peers have very, very wealthy clients. When they come to us, we send them to my peers because we're much more interested in working with people like us, people who have worked for their money, they value their money, and yet aesthetics becomes a pride of place and the ownership of their architecture. Next, please. This is probably a project I'm very proud of. Gurmeet asked me to show it, so I'm showing it today. We were hired about 8 years ago by Ajay Mehta, a wonderful person who runs an NGO called Seva Mandir. His family founded in Udaipur, run a very large education trust. And we worked in a village called Delwara. Next, please. We were asked to provide public sanitation infrastructure for the 600 families that live there. I made 27 trips to Delwara. And every time I would sit with the 60 or 70 or 80 women who would come, because the men all went to work in Udaipur about an hour away. And they would usually urinate or defecate either in Udaipur or at the bus stop on their way back. But the women would wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning and go in the fields. And that's where the assault would happen. And that's where the brutality would happen. And so they were really our clients. And they said, make us a place when we welcome the bridegroom and his family, we don't have the horror of seeing all the men urinate outside our house before they take our bride away. They said, give us a place where our girls and our boys who study for the board exam have a place where they can actually gather and take the exam and have a toilet. Give us a place where the inoculation camps held by the government are not held on the side of the road under a tent which stinks. So we really designed the toilet as a community space, built with local material, very simply built by hand. Next, please. But yet we designed it so that it would become a place where every man and every woman in that tiny village felt completely edified that this was their place. It has no running water, no electricity. All the rainwater from the roof is collected in gravity-fed tanks. It's all coming through the pipe without any pumps. The bamboo thatch with tin roofs ventilates naturally. The stone is local. Next, please. That's what it looks like. Next, please. This is a university for 3,000 students. We finished it about 3 years ago in Ahmedabad. We had won a national competition. It's an engineering school right next to the CEPT University, which is a very well-known school of architecture. And again, the client was very money conscious. He had very little budget. But even on the front facade of the building, beneath that great roof, above the roof of the auditorium below, is a loggia where 2,000 students can have a festival. They can gather in the afternoon. So part of our challenge in making even in these private commissions is how do you really carefully make public space? How do you give place of pride to everybody who's going to use that building? Next, please. The building is clad in Agra red sandstone. Exposed concrete, again, never needs to be painted, but becomes a very powerful architectural piece because many of the students who come here have never studied in a building before. They're coming from the hinterland of Gujarat. This is really, in a sense, their first exposure to architecture. The courtyard, the great Indian landscape architect, sort of Akshay and I share an admiration for Muhammad Shahir, who I worked with very closely for 10 years until his untimely demise last year. He designed a series of very beautiful granite plinths, almost like classrooms, where classes could take place outside. In the winter, a very major classical music festival, Saptak, is held in this courtyard. We picked up all the scraps of stone, of kadapa, of kota, and scraps of white marble. It's the cheapest way to make an all-stone mosaic. No tile is used here, no paint on the wall. The structure and the red sandstone screens really create the interior environment for the building. Next, please. We're working in Uttarakhand. We're using only the local river rock to make a housing community. These are what the buildings look like. Just very simple structures. Again, need no maintenance. They're off the place. They reflect and evoke the geography that they dwell in. Next, please. That's a view of the window. So even the way we curate the outdoor space is using the same material presence, which turns green in the monsoon with moss, which gets bleached dry in the summer, but the color of the stone always comes through. Next, please. We were very fortunate to win a competition. It was an international competition with the Aga Khan to design a museum for Humayun's tomb. And this, as you know, is one of Delhi's, if not the country's, preeminent World Heritage sites. And the challenge here is most of the museum, most of the 200,000 square foot museum is subterranean because it's a World Heritage site. One little portion where the British had built some barracks, which comes above ground, we can make a building that matches the height of the barracks, and this is where the cafeteria, the restaurant, the bookstore, the auditorium, the cultural amenities are. So again, we try and say that our work can be contemporary while following the rules and the modes of a historical presence that are always acknowledged but never mimicked. It's almost disrespectful to try and copy. Next, please. Here's what the interior subterranean galleries look like. Deep sky wells bringing light 20 feet below the ground where these amazing artifacts that have been found. So this is really, in His Highness the Aga Khan said to Christine and me when we won the competition, he said, don't make me a museum that is hermetic for Humayun's tomb. Make me a place that opens people's imagination to the contribution of the Mughals to India's culture, to its language, to its art, to its architecture, to its tapestry. So it's really a kind of opening of history and culture for the 2 million people who come here. Next. Even the way the exit stairs and ramps have been done, because we know how many million school children come here, let it become an outdoor classroom. Use intelligently spaces that were designed simply for means of egress as becoming places of repose. Next, please. That's a site photo from last week. So the structure is almost complete. It's coming together. Next, please. So this is where I digress. So after 15 years of working as an architect, I had an epiphany. Maybe it's called midlife crisis. And I realized that really what we were doing was making perhaps thoughtful, perhaps intelligently designed, but more or less private projects for private clients. And that's not what my education at Yale trained me to do. The exhortation was always make public work. It's easier said than done, especially in a place like India, where you know what you need to do to get public work. So 5 years ago, I proposed a project to the president of the University of Virginia, and she agreed to let me take on the challenge of designing a commons for the capital city, an ecological commons, which is the floodplain of the Yamuna. Some of you may be familiar with the Sabarmati riverfront in Ahmedabad, which is essentially a concrete embankment built on two sides to create an artificial lake. That's not what we were seeking to do. We are seeking to put back along a 22-kilometer stretch of the river public place, civic space, ecological space for the 20 million citizens of the National Capital Region. We found archival drawings that really allowed us to imagine how Shah Jahanabad had really placed itself front and center in a harmonious relationship with the geography and ecology of the Yamuna floodplain. Next, please. Here are exactly the two sites 300 years apart. We have littered and rendered desolate the entire floodplain of our river in the capital city with power plants, with storage yards, with dumping grounds, with landfills. Next, please. This is shocking. Keshav Chandra, a very dear friend, also is the CEO of the Delhi Jal Board. He and I took a walk. This is Taimur Nagar in East Delhi. All of the garbage from this entire neighborhood is dumped in this Nala. This was a perennial stream. This garbage is only 9 days old because every 10 days a bulldozer comes and pushes all this garbage into the Yamuna River. And then it's clean again, and then 10 days later this exercise is repeated. This is happening right now in our city. Next, please. We took water samples. This is publicly available data. For the last 5 years, I have commanded a team of 60 graduate students, fellow faculty. We've just assembled what is publicly known to all of us. The water quality at every single one of our benchmarks. Wazirabad, where a very clean Yamuna enters the city, to Okhla, where the most contaminated river possible leaves the city. The coliform bacteria count is sometimes 2,000% higher than WHO permissible standards. We take a live river at the point of its entry into our city and we release a dead river. 60% of the contamination and toxicity of the entire Yamuna River comes only from this 22-kilometer flow through the city of Delhi. That's devastating. Next, please. This is what we have done to a fertile and ecologically rich floodplain. We've let the engineers build concrete dams, prevent people from accessing culturally, geographically, and ritually important sites, and we have made and rendered the river invisible, which means that anyone can do whatever they want on the riverbed. Next, please. We have combined the lines that supply fresh water with the lines that carry sewage, so when they are illegally tapped and pilfered, one mixes with the other. For every 1 liter of clean water or supposedly clean water that you consume from your reverse osmosis filter, you waste 6 liters of water back into the system. So for 1 liter of drinking water, you waste 6 liters of drinking water. This is what our infrastructure in Delhi looks like today. And this is in Nizamuddin. Next, please. It was really shocking when 6 of my fellow faculty from the university came and they realized after 2 hours of walking on the floodplain, we couldn't see or hear a single bird. Can you imagine a river bank where not a bird will fly? That is how toxic this water is. Next, please. Delhi consumes food grown on this soil. Israeli scientists, when testing this soil 4 years ago to propose a pilot project for agriculture, said the soil was so laced with heavy metals that anything you ingest that is grown here, including your gobi and your mooli and your palak, is actually causing you cancer. This is toxic soil. Next, please. I guess this is what really got the Minister of Water Resources to wake up. We just simply looked at the 100-year flood marks. We know because of global warming, a 100-year flood, which is a flood that can happen in any year, it has a 1% possibility of happening every year, is actually now happening every 10 or 15 years. Global warming has caused the 100-year flood marks to happen much more frequently, which means that 3 million people in Delhi will be inundated if and when the Yamuna crosses a 100-year flood mark. Based on what has happened in Srinagar and what has happened in Chennai, this is not an if, but it's a when. So with this drawing, I mean, actually some drawings speak much louder than words. The ministry signed an MOU with us to help them for the next 5 years develop this ecological strategy for the Yamuna. Next, please. This is how most people live. And this is actually the better quality housing near the Yamuna. This is the British era barracks. Next, please. So, if I may, I just want to read one statement. This is from Juan Clos, who was the UN Habitat Commissioner and also the former mayor of Barcelona, who oversaw the transformation of Barcelona from a slum city using the Olympics of '92 to make it into probably one of the best, most livable, highly ranked livable cities in the world. And he says, good cities do not come about by accident. The prerequisites for a good city are broad community consensus, long-standing political determination, and sound urban planning, which over the course of time engender urban environments that can provide well-being and security to their inhabitants. Good cities definitively protect the urban communal space in which individual rights and opportunities are most respected. This is public space. These are our commons. Next, please. This is a project that my colleague who teaches with me, Iñaki Aldai, did in Spain. And they took a toxic landscape and a flooding landscape and they converted it into a water treatment and remediation floodable park in Aranzazi. And it's amazing because it totally transformed the life of a city, reintroducing its historic ecology and agriculture back into a river that is allowed to flood. And for the 11 months when the flood waters recede, it becomes an amazing organic park for the city. Next, please. Next, please. So I'll just walk you very quickly. I have about 5 minutes left before I finish. So these are some of the projects we have been developing collectively, and there's a opening in Delhi on the 29th at the India Habitat Center with the ministry. Please come if you can. We're going to make a presentation, and for the next 2 weeks you'll be able to publicly see all these projects. Next, please. So we've started mapping some of the historic sites of Delhi. We've mapped some of the really critical cultural sites of the city. We've also realized that history is not static. History is a movable thing. So depending on which point of history you try and anchor to, that point in history also has its own complexities that you must acknowledge. Next, please. So for instance, at Purana Killa, many of you know, the Emperor Humayun had a library in Purana Killa. He fell to his death in his library, which was within the confines of Purana Killa. One of the projects we're proposing to revitalize Purana Killa is to propose a new public library within the precinct of Purana Killa without damaging the historical fabric. Next, please. That's what it might look like. Why not be bold enough and courageous enough to say history can coexist with contemporary work, because the history has the strongest bones of all. Next, please. We looked at how the Yamuna is crossed and how these bridges are really barriers to human interface with the river. And we started to propose projects, and these are precedents from other cities that we've been studying for the last 5 years, where water treatment using a combination of biological remediation and wastewater treatment techniques can also result in creating very, very potent pieces of land where you can create other typologies of work that allow that piece of land to be better utilized. For instance, low-cost housing. Next, please. So you can create housing for the thousands and thousands of people who enter Delhi every day and the millions of people who live in subhuman conditions by creating very simple frameworks on land that is otherwise uncontested, on land that can ecologically sustain that habitation. Next, please. We looked at how can you transform existing pedestrian bridges. We don't want to make new bridges, but the design of these existing bridges can be modified with very subtle introductions of landscape and green mobility to make them more amenable as promenades for the citizens who live both on the east side and the west side of the river. Next, please. We are looking very carefully at how you do intelligent street design, how different modes of traffic, public transport, and slow and fast mobility can coexist. Next, please. We're looking at one of the most toxic drains. This is the Shadra drain. I mean, the effluent, if you try and stand next to the Shadra drain, after 5 minutes, your clothes stink, you can't breathe. We're trying to transform this into a bioremediation park. Next, please. And we're doing it very carefully in cooperation with the Delhi Jal Board, using their strategy of putting interceptor drains, but then helping them design the passage of those interceptor drains to become conduits for the public to be able to walk through these greenways and access the river. This is a plan drawing of the park. I know it might be hard to see. Next, please. But this is what that will look like. So suddenly you take what is now negative space in the city and you really charge it into becoming ecologically viable public space again. Next, please. The mosaic, Akshay talks about this, a lot of the speakers yesterday talked about this, but how do we bring back indigenous wetland planting? And we've got a whole range of species down to the 10-meter intervals where they occur and the floodplain levels, where they actually serve to keep the soil, they clean the water, they allow the nitrogen to be circulated. Next, please. How the channel of the water has to be slowed, how you design the flow pattern so it can flood and ebb and flood and ebb. Next, please. And how you can get a very beautiful set of water parks. There's no reason why we cannot be front and center with the infrastructure. We can go and see how our water is being cleaned. We might not need to use our ROs then and waste so much water if we were able to walk the many kilometers of these beautiful, lacy, cleansed streams that then cycle back into the circulation of the city. It was amazing for us to learn that when Shahjahanabad was built, the last house in Shahjahanabad to get the water from the Yamuna was the house of the king. The river flowed through the poorest parts of Shahjahanabad before the water came to the actual palace itself. What a remarkable act of generosity. Next, please. So in the last 5 years, we've documented over 500 interviews with citizens who live in these neighborhoods, both in East Delhi and on the West Bank. And we've created a taxonomy of the public amenities that are needed. And one of the most acute public needs is very, very simple public health infrastructure for just regular checkups, medical inoculation. So we're working with the Delhi government to start to say where can these be inserted as part of this project in some of these derelict landscapes. Next, please. Next, please. Community centers, old age homes. Next, please. How can they be fit within the landscape? So you provide a very simple armature within the existing park system, and then the people transform it into, next please, into something that becomes their own over time. You let time decide how the architecture needs to evolve. It's not a static program and it's not a static building. Next, please. The last thing I'm going to show, I know I'm really pushing the time, how conceptually we have treated Rajpath, which is actually an artifice. It's an artifice that was created in 1929. There was a ghat that led to the Yamuna, essentially less than 500 meters from the axis of Rajpath. And one of the most daring proposals we're making is that the President of India, once a year, should be able to walk down Rajpath or take his buggy down Rajpath and touch the river. And if the President of the country can go and touch the water of the Yamuna, then sure as hell the rest of the citizens will. So without touching a single building, without demolishing a single building, we've developed a pedestrian scheme, a spine which takes the gardens of Rajpath, wraps them around National Stadium, takes them past the lake of Purana Killa, through Pragati Maidan, and allows a new ghat to emerge on the banks of the Yamuna. Next, please. This will contain all of the botanical and biological cleansing systems that a park, a floodable river park needs to be. Next, please. It will contain all the new cultural infrastructure. When was the last time Delhi built a great museum for its people? Next, please. When was the last time we built a great library, an open public library for our people? All this infrastructure will constitute the spine of this walk. Next, please. A museum celebrating the independence of India should possibly occur right here. Next, please. And what better than a monitoring station for the quality of the river water to terminate the access? So this is where the President would make her or his offerings to the river, and this is where the President would once again gift the river back to her rightful owners, who are the people of the city. Next, please. I'm going to close here because I think that if we don't see this relationship between craft and material, between architectural aspiration and ecological presence, and between the most important person in the Anthropocene age that we live in, which is the human citizen, then we've lost the plot. Thank you very much.